Thank you for joining me today at Wonder Workshop's STEAM Summit for Fall 2022. I am here today to present about how you can leverage loose parts play for meaningful STEAM instruction in your early childhood setting. And just for clarification, I will be basing my presentation off of primarily preschool, but also integrating a little bit of a look at toddlers. So that would be the age that it's appropriate for, or I would say up through even kindergarten and first grade. I've used this model successfully. So thank you for joining me today. My name is Catherine Price. I am the owner and founder of a small business called Curious Kids Linfield, which I founded in 2015. I have two primary roles as the owner and educator of that business. One is that I teach workshops for early childhood age students. Primarily, we focus on physics, engineering, and at times other core concepts in science. I also work as a trainer and a professional development provider. I work with local preschools, public school districts. I've also taught at the regional, state, and national level at different conferences and professional learning communities about loose parts play. I am also an early childhood math and science methods professor at Salem State University in Salem, Massachusetts. And I supervise early childhood practica there. I am formerly a preschool, a first grade, and a math intervention teacher. And I also volunteer to run and oversee youth philanthropy experience in my area that educates young children on how on the many ways that they can give back to their communities. And I find that very rewarding. I'm also a parent. Today's agenda will be that we will look at tinkering, loose parts play, and I will share with you what it looks like for me. I will also share with you how it aligns with some of the standards that we teach off of. I've chosen the Head Start Early Learning Outcomes Framework because it's a federally shared and explored series of standards. And that is also because there isn't really anything else universally available in the United States, where probably many of our attendees are. It varies from state to state what the early childhood standards look like. And the next generation science standards begin at kindergarten and therefore aren't necessarily developmentally appropriate for preschoolers. So I've chosen the Head Start Early Learning Outcomes Framework because everybody can access it. After we look at how tinkering provides learning with the ELOF, we will also look at the 5 mini lessons I recommend you explicitly teach before launching this model in your classroom. We'll talk a little bit about existing theory, and I will model a brief mini lesson and read aloud for you and share what I would recommend you implement as extensions afterward. My objectives for today are that you will understand the connection between loose parts play, which I call tinkering, and the standards, that you will understand what prior learning experiences you should provide your students with and what you should explicitly teach procedurally and conceptually before launching tinkering in your classroom. And I will talk with you about what it can look like in your classroom to implement tinkering as a structure that you use weekly. So what is tinkering? Tinkering is loose parts play. In my world, tinkering is loose parts play that's tied to a literature connection. So I always use a read aloud as a jumping off point. I precede the loose parts play with explicit teaching. Some of that is procedural, meaning a procedure like putting the parts away, or some of it is conceptual, meaning an understanding that I want my students to have before they start their play. The loose parts play is always facilitated by a knowledgeable adult. So when my students get to this stage in the lesson where they're addressing a conflict that I gave them from my read aloud, I always am exploring alongside of them, answering questions, asking questions, noticing what one student is doing aloud to another student. And during that loose parts play, I propose a challenge that's intended to provoke learning, primarily in concepts relating to physics, to inquiry, and to engineering. Lastly, I always provide extensions so that students who might need some support to remain engaged can think about the challenge in a different way. So I take the concepts that we learned about, the conflict proposed by the story, I give students a challenge, and then I give them something else that they can do with the loose parts in order to extend their learning or to continue to engage if they choose to. At Curious Kids, which is the name of my business, and when I visit on site at local preschools, the model has 4 parts. I start with a read aloud. I do a short mini lesson, 3 to 5 minutes long. I give my students tinker trays, which are these trays of loose parts on the left side picture. And before I've done that, before my students are kind of launched at work, I explicitly teach expectations about the use of the parts and the cleanup of the parts. And I also limit the number of parts early on in the school year. So what you're seeing here is maybe you can see there are hearts on the windows. This is more than halfway through the school year in February. There's snow on the ground. These children have been engaging in loose parts play for a long time at the point that they have this many parts that are given to them early on. This would look more like 3 or 4 parts. Lastly, I give my students an invitation to create, which is using larger loose parts. Here you see a lot of recyclables to extend their learning a bit more. Let's talk about what each of those parts actually looks like. So a read aloud. I start with a read aloud in which I pick a high interest and a visually appealing children's text. On the left-hand side, I'm reading Peter Rabbit, but it's a pop-up version with kind of clearer illustrations by way of an example. I choose only stories that feature a problem and solution structure, or that encourage creative thinking. And I'll give you some examples of that later in our session. And when our story has a problem, we kind of look at the structure, and I share how the author has chosen to solve the problem in the story by the end, but we think about that problem in a different way in our loose parts play. And as I normally would with a read aloud, I pause to clarify language, I preview about the story structure, I engage in think alouds just the same way as I would with other read alouds, not tied to tinkering. Following the read aloud, I engage in a mini lesson with students. So that's the next feature of a tinkering experience. The mini lesson, I wrote 5 to 7 minutes. I would even say less, unless I really need more time, 3 to 5 minutes. And it has a granular focus in which I'm explicitly teaching a concept. Sometimes it's a concept such as stability that can be applied in tinkering, but other times it's a procedure that's used in tinkering, like material selection, cleaning up, how to think about materials that work together well or that are stable together, that kind of thing. Then after the read aloud and the mini lesson, my students get to work with an open-ended challenge that I've posed. So for example, one of the lessons that I do with my students is the 3 Billy Goats Gruff. And I read the story aloud to my students, and we talk about how a challenge in the story was that the bridge wasn't tall enough or protective enough to keep the troll away from the goats, and the troll kept getting up on the bridge and stopping the goats from crossing to the meadow where they wanted to graze, if you're familiar with the story. And so what I do is I give my students a challenge that's grounded in the details of the story. When my students engage in Tinker Trays, in using Tinker Trays, they identify the challenge, and we explicitly teach each of these skills. So we work on telling ourselves and each other what is this challenge in the story. We work on the idea of brainstorming and selecting the solution we think is best, and we use all of that vocabulary: problem, brainstorm, solution. We draft a plan. And so what that looks like in preschool is two different things, depending on the children's developmental abilities. And we'll talk about that in depth a little later in our session. But each child creates a plan. It varies what the medium is for the plan. And then students use the loose parts to create designs. We also work on responding to failure. So if your design fails, if it doesn't solve the problem or it doesn't stay up, how can you look and think critically about what went wrong? During the loose parts play, the Tinker Trays, the teacher sits with the students or goes from table to table in order to facilitate exploration of the concepts. And during that time, the teacher models executive functions such as initiating, organizing, and also works with students on emotional regulation. Preschoolers, in my experience, have really big feelings, and failure most particularly can elicit strong feelings. And we really work on noticing those feelings, noticing the physical manifestation of the feelings and how to respond productively to them. And then additionally, just worth pointing that the materials my students are allowed to use are limited to what's in the trays. And trays can be shared by multiple students. So typically 2 to 4 students are working at one tray. The last feature is an open-ended invitation to create. And so I give students a second challenge, either at their Tinker Trays or at a large table nearby. It depends on the school where I'm visiting or if I'm in my own space and what's available. And it's just generally either trying the same challenge with different materials or extending the challenge in some way by introducing new materials. I oftentimes will include books and visuals as inspiration. So for example, if we were working on the Billy Goat's Gruff challenge, I would include photos of different kinds of bridges all over the world. And I would include different types of bridges because there are different technologies that have been created through the engineering process to allow people to cross things they didn't used to be able to cross. And this allows students to sustain engagement with tinkering. While some students are working at the trays, others may have a shorter attention span, be ready to move on, and they can do the open-ended invitation to create in a new space nearby. Why do we engage in tinkering? So the reason that I love tinkering and I really believe in the model is that I feel like it offers really authentic and engaging learning opportunities with lots of different standards, and not just the cognitive, but also the social emotional skills. And so we will actually look at both today. So what you're looking at is a matrix of the central domains in the Head Start Early Learning Outcomes Framework, which often people in the biz call the ELA. And it shows across both the infant, toddler, and the preschooler domains how these different concepts are broken down. So I liked the visual and wanted to include it. So again, in case you tuned in late or missed the very beginning of the presentation for any reason, I wanted to be clear in my lessons. I always align with standards. I'm in Massachusetts, so I'm using the Massachusetts Science, Technology, and Engineering frameworks. We have standards written into those for preschool. And I use the guidelines for preschool learning experiences and approaches to play for thinking about social emotional development. But because this is an international conference with people in all states and many different countries, I wanted to pick a reference that would be easy to find for everybody. So I picked the Head Start Early Learning Outcomes Framework because I knew that anybody anywhere could easily Google the ELOF and access it. And also because the next generation science standards, unfortunately, do not have science standards for preschool. They start in kindergarten. So this is kind of our one centralized federal document, in my opinion, that offers us standards for early learning. So at the infant, toddler, and preschool level, tinkering offers lots of implicit learning opportunities with skills that children use to engage in learning. And this was a quote from the ELOF: supporting children's skills in this approaches to learning domain helps children acquire knowledge, learn new skills, and set and achieve goals. How children engage in learning influences development in all domains and directly contributes to success in school. So we're going to look at the approaches to learning first. Children can gain competence with these skills even if they aren't explicitly taught to them. And I just want to make a plug, because it's my own philosophy: explicit teaching and modeling of these approaches to learning type skills would be best for your students, and not assuming that students are just absorbing these lessons through implicit learning opportunities. So what are the approaches to learning? Within the approaches to learning, what are the skills that I believe tinkering offers children an opportunity to learn? I think that tinkering allows children to learn how to manage emotions with increasing independence, follow the routines that you teach as part of tinkering, and there are a few. I think that it allows children to learn how to independently handle classroom materials and be responsible for them. I also believe that it helps build executive functioning, and the skills in the executive functions that I see the most in use when children are tinkering is persistence, is holding information and using it to perform different tasks, and to be flexible thinkers. That's a big one, because failure does happen when you're tinkering, and designs fail, and productivity is all about how do we respond to them. This model definitely looks to build initiating skills in children. Children learn and practice the skill of getting started with a plan and taking that first step. That can be tricky for children who have some areas of relative weakness within the executive functions. And I also firmly believe that tinkering builds creativity in young children. Within infants and toddlers in the approaches to learning domain, again, tinkering helps children manage feelings and emotions, and modulate their behavior with the support of adults. Tinkering helps build the amount of time a child is able to sustain attention and focus, and to persist in efforts to complete a task. And again, just like with preschoolers, I think tinkering builds flexibility in toddlers. It also, again, really encourages that initiating and curiosity in young children, in toddlers. And again, it's a creative learning opportunity. Additionally, it allows toddlers to explore people and objects and think about them in relation to themselves. And it's a great, authentic way for toddlers to explore causal relationships, where they explore what happens when they act on these parts. And then it also encourages toddlers to use different kinds of reasoning and problem-solving strategies when what they're making doesn't stay up, when they have to think about what they need to build, and it allows them to practice reasoning with these parts and this problem. So all of those, and I just want to make sure I'm clear, all of these various approaches to learning domain skills are really things that you, in setting up tinkering provocations, you will be offering implicit learning opportunities for your children, for your young students, whether that's preschoolers or toddlers. I personally do model and explicitly teach a lot of these skills. I don't just leave it up to my children to experience and grow with these skills over time on their own. And so I model, what does it look like to make a plan and get started? What does it look like when I have a big feeling that's not so good? And how does it make my body feel? And how can I respond to that in a way that's safe for myself and others? I model persistence. I model how to think flexibly. And so what I'm kind of advocating for is that I think tinkering is a great model because it provides experience in utilizing these skills. It's also important as an early educator that you model how children can demonstrate and use these skills. And I just wanted to have said that. Let me go back to where I was before. So tinkering also provides explicit teaching and learning opportunities that foster cognitive development in young children, as long as you are structuring those for the young children in your classroom. And I loved this quote from the ELOF: children play an active role in their own cognitive development by exploring and testing the world around them. That's implicit learning. But they also need support from parents, teachers, and other adults to make meaning of those experiences. And that is our job. And so what do those explicit learning opportunities look like? In the cognition domains for infants and toddlers, that looks like being able to identify, describe, compare, and compose shapes. And it looks like building spatial awareness. So using terms like next to, or above, or below. And I've given a couple of examples. So in planning with toddlers and early preschoolers, in the planning stage where we make a picture of what our design is going to look like, I don't expect that those young children are going to be able to represent shapes while manipulating a writing implement or a crayon. Instead, my students use placemats, or these are actually cutting mats, and I have wiki sticks. We work early on before we launch our tinkering model. We work on recognizing and then making straight and curved lines. And we do that so that my students are able to develop that vocabulary and demonstrate this skill. That allows them to learn how to compose shapes and how to describe them. And I explicitly teach those both with my toddler classes and my early preschool classes. And I usually reinforce it with my older preschoolers as well. So then here you can see this student made a picture of their plan, and then this was their actual plan. And as I circulate in my classes, and again, it's fairly easy to circulate because typically I'm working with, somewhere between sort of 8 to maybe 15 students. Occasionally, if I work with a mixed age classroom, we'll have larger numbers like 20 up to sort of 24. But in that setting, I've worked with those classroom teachers to support me as I circulate, and they're circulating too and reinforcing the same lessons that I've already taught. So moving on so this is kind of the more cognitive focus of the ELOF, and these are learning opportunities that toddlers can have in using the tinkering model in math. And for preschoolers, that looks like scientific inquiry and also reasoning and problem solving. So through tinkering, you can explicitly teach in mini lessons and then explore several different of these standards, including observing different kinds of phenomena and describing them, meaning what objects stay up, what fall down, what objects work together well, what don't, and why. We engage in scientific thought, and we also categorize phenomena. For example, we talk a lot in tinkering about stability. So a lot of what we're categorizing is using the vocabulary stable and unstable. We also work a lot on reasoning and problem solving. So we define what the question is and the conflict is that children are being asked to use through this engineering process. And we make predictions by picking our favorite idea from our brainstorm of solutions, because that is a prediction that the design we're picking is going to be the most successful design. We plan and conduct investigations and experiments by making a plan and trying it, knowing it could fail, and we learn to analyze the results, draw conclusions, and communicate our results when we explore whether our prototype or our design worked and think about what we could do differently if it failed. I keep going the wrong way when I'm advancing my slides. I apologize. So the tinkering model also offers you a model where you can provide learning opportunities in physics and engineering because it allows your students to be mentally active. They're engaging in exactly what you just taught, and they're not distractive. They can be socially interactive with each other as they work and as they share ideas, and they build meaningful connections to their lives because they think about this problem and solution format and they integrate those skills in their lives, which is really important. Okay, so we have about 40 minutes left. I want to make sure that I give you a good feel for what you would need to teach in order to launch this model in your setting. And so that's where we're headed next, so that you feel equipped to prepare your students to work independently with this skill. And then we'll look a little bit at a theoretical framework, and I will finish by modeling a mini lesson. Okay, so before launching a tinkering program in your classroom, I would advocate for explicitly teaching and reinforcing 4 different procedures and 1 concept. And I actually, let me back up for 1 second. And I should have said to you, when I teach tinkering in my classroom, and I talked to you way back before we started talking about the standards, we talked about the features of the tinkering model. Let me just go back for a second. And I should have said, this is going to look different in different classrooms. With older preschoolers, perhaps you could do a read aloud and a mini lesson, and students could engage for that long. Typically, I would say you're probably looking at 15 minutes for a read aloud and a mini lesson. That's the upper reaches of what you would want your students seated for in preschool. So these can all be broken up. And I'm not sure if I said that. You can do a read aloud at the beginning of your day. And then before your students go to their small group work, you can do a mini lesson, later in the morning, and then they're working at the Tinker trays independently. So the idea isn't that you would do all 4 of these things in a row. You would break this up to be developmentally appropriate. And I should have said that. Sorry, I'm going to go back to slide 21, which is where we left off looking at launching a tinkering program. Okay. So I don't know if you enjoy the show Schitt's Creek, but we just finished watching it with our daughter and find ourselves constantly quoting it. So I added a little picture of David and said, ew, procedures. So these are not the most exciting part of tinkering, but they, to me, as a preschool teacher and a first grade teacher, I always kind of front loaded my expectations and my routines in the first few weeks of school so that my students felt confident to be independent with routines like pencil sharpening, asking to go to the bathroom. And I think the same principle applies here. I like to explicitly pre-teach these procedures so that my students feel independent and confident with them before I expect them to work independently. And I just did say these 5 lessons are written the way that you would present to preschoolers because that's my area of expertise. You would approach that differently if you were teaching infants and toddlers because they would not necessarily be able to master these skills in the same way. But you also work off of different loose parts. So some of this doesn't exactly apply for toddler age. So the 4 procedures that I model explicitly and that we go back to again and again are identifying the challenge and brainstorming lots of different solutions to the challenge before picking our favorite. So that's 1. I model creating a plan, and in doing so, I also model applying spatial skills. I do a lot of modeling and explicit teaching about material selection, and I model what it looks like to put all of the steps together and create an actual design. And as part of that, I model how to respond to failure if my design fails. Those are the 4 procedures I explicitly teach repeatedly before I launch tinkering as like a center in my classroom. And I also do a lot of exploring with stability as kind of a primary physics concept that students need to understand for tinkering independently. So this is an anchor chart that I use in all of my classes. It varies from class to class and age to age how visual versus here there are not any visuals supporting on the anchor chart, but I explicitly teach each step. I have an arrow that I move from step to step, and I really focus on the vocabulary. So the steps of tinkering, I teach one by one, and we don't advance to the next until we've kind of mastered or have a great kind of developing understanding of the step. Even telling ourselves what our job is takes lots of modeling. So identify your job is the first step. Brainstorm ideas and pick one is the second step. Make a plan, and again, that looks different for different developmental ages. Picking materials, and then building and testing, trying again if you need to. So there are 5 steps in tinkering. So this is the one concept that I'm going to focus on with you for today. The rest of the mini lessons are procedural. When you teach about stability, your objective is that your students will be able to identify movements and materials that are stable and unstable. I pre-teach the word stable and the word unstable, and I model it. So one of my lessons is just yoga, where we practice mountain pose, which is the bottom picture, 2 feet on the ground. And we practice tree pose, which is the top picture, 1 foot on the ground. And I do that so that my students can explore what it looks like to have enough support and what it feels like to have enough support underneath what you're working with. And we talk about how mountain pose feels stable, and we do a lot of thinking about why. And then we talk about how tree pose feels a little unstable, or at least if you do yoga the way that I do, it feels unstable. And we talk about why. And what that lesson or lessons will look like is investigating different materials that are stable and unstable. And I define stable as something that can stay up without your help. And I define unstable as something that can't stay up without help. That is a really easy way to define the idea or the concept. I typically start with large solo cups because they're pretty hardy. And I move towards smaller and more challenging materials as we kind of progress in the tinkering model. We make our own stable and unstable cup stacks. We share anecdotes about as support for why we think our cup stacks were stable and unstable. And in doing so, we explore lots of different ideas about stability. And I just am showing you an example of a modeled mini lesson that I'm actually going to show you in full later on. And then down here, my students at this point had made, this was around January, my students made trees that a bird could sit in. And you can see this student started with a wider part on the bottom, the cup, and then they applied principles of stability by making sure that they had flat surfaces on flat surfaces in their stack. This looks a little unstable and tippy to me. One of the things that we talk about is if you get too tall and too skinny, typically you run into issues with stability. All right, so moving on to procedures. The first procedure that I teach is identifying a challenge and brainstorming solutions to the challenge. So in this lesson or lessons, the objective is that students will be able to tell themselves their task with an I can statement and generate many varied solutions to the task. So in the beginning, I do this as a think aloud. So going back to that 3 billy goats gruff story, identifying the challenge is typically something I teach as an echo first. So I can, and then I tell my students to say, I can build a bridge that the troll can't get on. And then we tell it to ourselves independently. And over time, we work on think alouds where students can explore what was the problem in the book and what could I do to be a part of the solution. Once we've kind of learned how to identify a challenge or a problem in a story, we start to share solutions. And I teach explicitly that that vocabulary word brainstorm. And I also explicitly use the vocabulary challenge or problem and solution over and over again. When we do our final lesson on this, I like to go back to Peter Rabbit. We talk about the word problem. We talk about how one of the problems in the story was that Peter couldn't get under the fence to get away from Mr. McGregor, the farmer. And we make a height giver where we solve the problem by making Peter a tool that he can use to get over the fence instead of trying to get under the fence. And then I just said, when children have a little bit of trouble identifying the challenge, we use a reading comprehension strategy. So if students are not really able to participate or aren't really sharing the challenge during a read aloud, we back up and reread, and we think about what we saw happening in the story. And I teach my students that they can read the pictures, because we're really at the pre-reading stage in preschool for most kids. And but children can gather a lot of information and build a lot of comprehension of a story just through what the visual presentation of the story is. So we do a lot of backup and reread when we are struggling to identify the challenge in the specific story. Anyway, in this mini lesson, I model a think aloud of how I could solve the problem. I come up with lots of different ideas. I encourage my students to share lots of different ideas. And when we've generated sort of 6 or 8 ideas, I restate those ideas, and I ask students to pick their favorite that they think they're going to use to get started when they get to the Tinker trees. And that way you're kind of scaffolding that initiating skill that for some children can really be a challenge. So once children have become a little bit more independent and skillful with identifying the challenge and brainstorming solutions, I give them loose parts to work with. And again, these are a sequence of introductory lessons. So this isn't then children go play with the loose parts. This is that's the conclusion, or it's a conclusion that leads to children can try building a height giver with just the blocks in the blocks area, for example. The next thing that I work on with my students is creating a plan. And as I had mentioned earlier, that typically looks 2 different ways depending on the developmental age of the students. For students who have pretty decent fine motor skills, my plans are small pieces of paper or Post-it notes, and that's intentional so that students don't get bogged down with drawing a super detailed plan with, puppies and rainbows and a sunshine, and instead focus on this is just a sketch. And we use that term, sketch. This isn't a drawing that could hang in a museum. This is you drawing a quick picture that shows the types of lines you're using or shapes that you're using in what you create. If students are not able to use paper and crayon yet, as you can see on the right, just another example of plans that students are making on placemats or knife mats with Wikisticks. And we work on identifying and making curved and straight lines first, and then in a second procedural lesson, we work on using curved and straight lines to make a picture. In this case, a plan, a picture of what technology they're going to create to solve the problem in the story. You can do this with Wikisticks. You can also do this with Play-Doh snakes. You would need to include time to model how to make Play-Doh snakes that they roll in their hands, and they can make curved and straight lines out of that if you don't have Wikisticks. But I explicitly teach how to make curved lines and straight lines and how to identify them. And then I use a story, a read aloud, and we identify curved and straight lines that the illustrator used in the story. And those are the vocabulary for the lesson, and that's the objective, is that students will learn to use those curved and straight lines to recognize and make representative shapes. And I always make sure, just as an aside, from the methods professor perspective, I always explicitly state the objective and tell students why we're doing what we're doing. So in the beginning of this lesson, I would say, my goal for us today is that you're going to learn how to notice what a curved line looks like and what a straight line looks like. And we're going to try to find examples of those in our story. And then I show what curved and straight lines look like on with WikiSticks, and then I ask my students to make them, and only then do we try to recognize them in a story. And then we move towards using curved and straight lines to make our plans for our design. The next procedure I teach is materials selection, and the idea is that you give them criteria for thinking about what materials they need and use. Preschoolers tend to be people who love to gather lots of materials without much thought for, is this useful? And so by explicitly teaching to think about the parts, I try to encourage them to think about stability and instability, but also value. And in doing so, hopefully I build value for the parts themselves. So we learn to identify parts that tend to be stable or unstable. And we look at parts that are flat and round because typically that does contribute to stability or instability. And so I remind students of the stable and unstable lessons that we've done. And then we explore the parts in the trays one at a time. So it's actually their first time getting to explore the trays. And we do that seated in the circle in front of us, not at tinkering tables. And so you can see in the left side picture, I include flat parts, like this is a jumbo craft stick. It's actually short and kind of wide. I included small paper cups, like toothbrush cups. Those are fairly stable. Unstable are these plastic egg halves. They can stack on top of each other with limited stability. They're quite unstable to build on top of. And then in the foreground, I'm not sure you can really see, but there's a large plastic spool. And spools are kind of interesting because they're a combination of flat and round in the sense that they have the ability to roll because they're round, but they also have two flat surfaces. Additionally, so moving on, I also, I'm just making sure I included, yes. So the last procedure that I really teach is putting all the steps of tinkering together. And so what that'll look like, apologies. What that'll look like is giving students an actual read aloud and challenge experience, and going through all the steps in succession, with the exception of the read aloud, which you might want to do separately if your students are developmentally not old enough to sit for a story and a lesson and engage in it meaningfully. So through this experience, the hope is that they understand the steps by putting them all together. And we also practice thinking like engineers. And I model creating a design that fails during this lesson so that I can also model practicing emotional regulation when my design fails. So I revisit an old story for this. We go through the anchor chart together. And then I model accidentally building an unstable design. And I model two ways to respond. I model with great visible upset. And I also model thinking like an engineer. And after showing both ways I could respond, I ask my students which of my approaches would actually allow me to solve the problem. Students vote that keeping my cool kind of helps me solve the problem, and we finish out the challenge. We talk about how having big feelings is okay, and we talk about how, variable success with moderating big feelings is also okay, that we're always learning and growing. But we try to sort of place it in the context of what will allow us to continue the work and solve the problem. So when I think about what's appropriate for preschool age children with tinkering, some of my favorites are corks, wood cubes. I use the 3/4 inch size, but you can use lots of different sizes. I like clear plastic shot glasses. I like those because my students, if they break, they're not expensive to replace. I also like the clear acrylic cubes that look like ice cubes. They are slippery, so they can be frustrating, but they are also highly appealing to young children. I also like small wood spools because I think the grain of the wood allows them to be fairly stable, and it allows children to explore stability and instability by being given materials that are both round and flat. I also like those wide craft sticks that I showed you. Some other suggestions are small paper bathroom cups. You saw those in that last picture. I often will use 3x5 index cards that I cut in half. I use solo cups, but they don't fit in the trays. I use non-hinged clothespins. I use bottle caps. We seem to get a lot of those donated by our families. We also get a lot of wine corks donated. I like small colored buttons just because they're visually appealing if you offer one section of your tray full of all different color buttons. And then I will also integrate some natural materials such as pebbles, shells, gumballs we get here. Obviously, that's geographical. Acorn caps we get here at this time of year in the fall. Sometimes I'll include metal nuts and bolts. I also, when I'm working and consulting with a preschool that's putting together trays and we're working on how to be cost effective, something I'll suggest is leftover sets of toys. For example, a handful of Unifix cubes or a handful of little stacking blocks where there isn't a complete set. With toddlers, many of the same parts are okay as long as they're supervised. If you're concerned about being able to remain on site, you need to think about items that do not fit through a paper towel or toilet paper roll. Anything larger than that is also safe for their use. Duplos, wool dryer balls, cardboard containers that you've taped or glued back together so that it's a 3D block. Jumbo craft sticks, magnetiles, wood blocks, flat rocks. You can purchase flat rocks, like some people use them to make kindness rocks at Michael's. The lids of different containers, like oatmeal containers. And then I also like tree blocks and tree cookies. They're rather unstable, so it can be frustrating for toddlers, but they're, I think they're attractive and, visually appealing. And then I would just say with toddlers, you're not going to want to use bento box style trays like the ones I showed you in pictures. Let me go back. So for toddlers, these trays are, by the way, I purchased, these are just bamboo utensil trays. The sections are movable and I purchased mine from Amazon. I am not receiving any kind of kickback on saying so, but that's where I got mine. With toddlers, you would want to use something that is a larger tray or at least has larger sections since your parts are going to be larger. So that might be a Rubbermaid container, a jelly pan, a bread basket, something that's a little bit more flexible because cleanup may not look like sorting as effectively. And then I just wanted to make some suggestions for books that you can use to generate inspiration for tinkering. And these are really more for preschool age. Some of my favorites are 21 Elephants and Still Standing, which is about P.T. Barnum's publicity stunt where he crossed 21 elephants over the Brooklyn Bridge in order to encourage people to feel safe on the Brooklyn Bridge. And with that, I built a bridge. I had my students build a bridge that held 21 elephants. And we used, I gave them a Ziploc of pennies, 21 pennies. I love the book, If I Built a House, If I Built a School, and If I Built a Car. They're by Chris Van Dusen. And they're super imaginative and creative. They all encourage design thinking to create, what would it be like if you created your dream house, dream school, or dream car. Three Little Pigs. I like the version by Mara Alperin the best. And encourage students to make a house that is big enough for a pig, or if they're a little bit more advanced, you can ask them to make it wolf-proof by making it a house that stays up and is stable even if they blow on it. Three Billy Goats Gruff, as I mentioned. I love Not a Box and Not a Stick, and there I give students kind of creative license. Turn this box, which I use the little cardboard jewelry boxes, or turn this stick into something else using loose parts, and we share at the end of the museum walk. I love the Peter Rabbit abridged version that's not quite so dark and quite so long. And then I also love the book Fun in the Sun by David Catrow, which features a Chihuahua with who gets a sunburn at the beach. And I have the students build a sun shelter. So I picked these examples because I think they're all high interest books, visually very appealing, and they really kind of firmly demonstrate that problem solution structure, with the exception of not a box and not a stick. So just a couple more tips. Remember that you need to really think about what procedures you want to teach, and teach them before you launch tinkering, before you allow students to independently work through tinkering without you pre-teaching. Some of the routines that you'll want to teach are taking the trays out and putting them away, how to put the materials back where they found them so that they're each in their own section by type, and how it will look at the space you choose for tinkering. Is it a whole class space? Probably not. So how will students know if there's space for them or not? I always recommend trying to acquire things through donation, including your parent community, but also local businesses. I know here in the Boston area, we have a reuse center just north of Boston called the Beautiful Stuff Project. If you Google reuse centers, you can often find places, and a lot of local businesses will donate extra materials to reuse centers. A few of each type of material in each tray is enough. You don't need to have, if you think about how many pieces children will actually need when they're playing with loose parts, they don't need a ton of any one type of part. And then I also will mix up my materials. So I don't keep my trays the same all year round. I often will integrate, things that are coming, like little plastic snowflakes or what have you, in order to kind of capture their attention. And my materials are all non-consumable and reusable. My students do not take home what they build with loose parts. They're not gluing or taping them together or any of that stuff. They're using them like Legos, putting them together and taking them apart and putting them away. I really model explicitly all the behaviors I want my students to engage in. So early on, it's, what are the work habits, and really kind of modeling think alouds, all of that. And then I really am intentional in what I set up for the Tinker Trays. So what I read aloud to them to inspire the challenge, I think about what I want them to explore. If we're looking at properties of solids, I'll swap out my parts so that they're a variety of bumpy versus smooth. And as I am playing with my students in at the Tinkering Center, I will model that language, thinking aloud. Oh, that's bumpy. Oh, that's smooth. And not necessarily, explicitly teaching it as a lesson, but just providing incidental learning opportunities that I am provoking on purpose. Okay, so we are next headed to look briefly at theory. I'm going to do that quickly because I want to leave time for a mini lesson. And any questions we won't be leaving time for, but you can send me an email on the last slide. I include my email address. And so I picked this because I run marathons, and this is the intersection of Boylston and Hereford, where you head for the finish line of the Boston Marathon. So where we're headed next is a quick look at pedagogy and then a modeled lesson, and that will wrap up our time together. And loose parts play, the origin to me, and based on a lot of reading I've done, really comes from two major models. One is Simon Nicholson's theory of loose parts, and the other is the Reggio Emilia approach. So Simon Nicholson was actually a landscape engineer, and his theories were popularized during playground construction post-war in the UK, not post-war, it's probably the late 60s, early 70s, that his thinking became popular as it applied to preschool. So he really didn't like task-specific materials on playgrounds. He liked the materials to be open-ended and unique and encourage creative play. And then I always think of the Reggio approach because in the ateliers of the Reggio schools, the Atelierista sets up provocations with pictures and parts, and children kind of take inspiration from the pictures and parts and take it from there. But the Atelieristas are thinking, they hope that with these parts in this picture, the child will X, Y, and Z, whatever the task is that they want. I always like this picture. Here's a task-specific mailbox. I use this in my dramatic play area, and I use it with little success because it really only has one purpose. Over here, you see a child creating really imaginative play using loose parts because there's any number of things that any of those parts can be. Okay, so the 4 components of tinkering, and these can be held together or apart depending on the developmental readiness of your students, are a read aloud, a mini lesson with either looking at either a procedural or conceptual skill, tinker tray play, and then an extension, which I just call invitation to create. And the sample I wanted to give you is a read aloud of Three Little Pigs. And again, this is not the Mara Alperin version, but that's my favorite. I just like the pictures and I like how the story is kind of told. And I'm also going to model a stability lesson. The tinker trays, I'm not going to show you because you saw so many pictures of them, but the tinker tray challenge I would give my students would be to plan and create a stable house for a pig. And then if my students were engaged in that, they could move to invitation to create a separate table to try to make a house that's wolf proof, which means that it must be stable just as the pig house must be, but it also can't fall down when the wolf blows on it. So those you won't see as part of this lesson, the tinker trays and the invitation to create. Okay, so Three Little Pigs. So in the story of the Three Little Pigs, you probably already know this, but it's about 3 little pigs who go out to kind of find their way in life, and they encounter a challenge, which is the big bad wolf. So this is the story of the 3 little pigs. Sorry, I think I have to click through. Once upon a time, there were 3 little pigs. The pigs lived in a small house with their mom. One day, their mom sent them off to build houses of their own. As they walked down the road, the first little pig met a farmer pulling a cart of straw. It looked very warm, just right for building a house. He asked if he could have some. The farmer agreed, and the first little pig began to build his straw house. So straw is like hay, and this man picked a bunch of hay out of a field somewhere, and he's carrying it. A little way down the road, the second little pig saw a woodcutter with a cart of sticks. They looked thick and long, just right for building a house. He asked if he could have some. The woodcutter agreed, and the second little pig began to build his wooden house. And I'm sorry for the ebook, that's a little bit limited. I just wanted to have something that you would be able to see and follow along with. And I thought if I held a book for a recording that you might not really be able to see and follow along. The third little pig trotted down the road. After a short time, he met a builder, pushing a wheelbarrow full of bricks. The third little pig thought to himself, how strong those bricks look. I think they would make an excellent house. So the third little pig asked the builder for some of the bricks, and he began to build a house that was stronger and bigger than the others. Soon, all 3 little pigs had a house of their own, and they were all very happy. Then one day, a big bad wolf came walking along the road. And I'm going to stop here for a second because if I were doing this with my students right now, as this story progressed, I would ask them to give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down to tell me how they felt about each material. I would ask them what they know about grass and whether it's stable or unstable and what might be some problems with the material. Same with the sticks and same with the bricks. And we would do a little bit of thinking about which material we thought was best. The wolf saw the first little pig in his straw house. With an evil glint in his eye, he knocked on the first little pig's door. Little pig, let me come in, he said. Not by the hair on my chinny chin chin. I will not let you in, cried the little pig. Then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in, growled the wolf. And the wolf huffed and he puffed, and he blew the straw house down. The first little pig ran all the way to his brother's wooden house. The wolf was soon at the house made of sticks. He knocked on the door. Little pigs, let me come in, he snarled. Not by the hairs on our chinny chin chins. We will not let you in, cried the frightened little pigs. And here, if you want, you can have your students chime in and say these same rhymes with you. Then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down, growled the wolf. The wolf huffed and he puffed and he blew the house down. The two little pigs ran as fast as they could all the way to their brother's brick house. The wolf was soon at the brick house. He knocked on the door. Little pigs, let me come in, he growled. Not by the hairs on our chinny chin chins. We will not let you in, squeaked the little pigs. Then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down, roared the wolf in his loudest voice. The wolf huffed and he puffed, and he huffed and he puffed, but he could not blow the brick house down. The big bad wolf's very angry. He looked at the house and saw the chimney. As quick as a flash, he climbed up on the roof and into the chimney. But the big bad wolf was in for a big surprise. The third little pig had been making soup, and there was a big pot of boiling soup on the fire. Wolf slid down the chimney and landed right in it. Splash! How do you think he felt? I'm going to show you. With a loud howl, the foolish wolf jumped out of the pot, ran out of the house, and off down the road. Little pigs cheered loudly. The big bad wolf was never seen again, and the three little pigs lived happily ever after. So I'm going to close out of that and go back to my slides. And so I'm rushing a little bit because I just want to come in under an hour, which was kind of the promised amount of time on my session. And so I would take a little more time with that story and think aloud and define the problem and the solutions. The problem was that the wolf was able to blow down the straw house and the wood house, which were unstable. But when the parts were put together with mortar, with cement or concrete, they were able to stay up. They were also heavier pieces that wouldn't have been able to be blown down by the wolf. And so as I was reading aloud, I would really define that for the students. What's the problem and how might the problem be solved? Today's mini lesson is going to be exploring new materials. So these are a medium-sized cup. Remember, I referenced solo cups and I referenced bathroom cups, dental cups. And this is a new material. So I just wanted to model how I would introduce new materials. So I would give each of my students about 6 of these, and I would ask them to touch them and feel them and see if they could share what do they notice with their hands, what do they notice with their eyes, and what do they think about using these as a part. And I would ask each of those questions separately. And as I asked the question, I would encourage my students to turn and talk to a partner, so somebody seated next to them. And then we would explore stability. What I would do to explore stability is I would build a cup stack with these. And I'm going to try to hold this up so that you can see it. It's a little tricky, but I would build 2 on the bottom and 1 on the top and ask my students what they noticed about stability and instability. And then I would try putting 2 cups on the top and 1 on the bottom and ask them what they thought about stability and instability and how we would work with these parts to build. We would look at how some sides are flat on the cup and others aren't. And I don't know if you can see that when I put the cup on its side, because it's round, it's moving. So we would explore that motion together. And we would explore how the materials could work together. How can they be stacked in a way that creates structure? So big side to big side, they can be put together. Little side to little side, they can be put together. Do they work together if you do little side to big side? Not exactly, because the cup is an open container, not a closed container. And so that makes it a little tricky to work with. We would also talk about what could make it fall down. In the context of this lesson, this would not be a great material for a wolf-proof house because it's very easy to blow over. And so that wouldn't be a great material for that specific challenge. Sorry, I advanced my slide when I did that. So from there, I would let my students know, boys and girls or friends, avoiding gendered terms, I am going to put these into your Tinker Trays, and these will be available for you to explore as part of your challenge today. And then I would go on to tell them today's challenge, go on to talk about different solutions to the challenge, and I would have each student share what solution they're going to try to create, and they would put that solution into their head. That's how we think of it. And that's what they're going to be drawing a picture of on their plan as they get started at Tinkertrays. From there, my students would head to Tinkertrays to build a stable house for a pig out of loose parts. That's their challenge. And if they want to extend the challenge, they can stay at Tinkertrays or move to the invitation to create table in order to try building a house that's not only stable for the pigs, but that also keeps the wolf out, so can't be blown down. So that's pretty much it. I think that we're about at exactly an hour. And so I just wanted to say, again, this is my name, Catherine Price. I post pictures from my lessons and also my methods classes on my Instagram page. They also get posted to my Facebook page. So you can give me a follow on Instagram or Facebook. And this is my email address. So if you have questions about anything that I covered today, please feel free to shoot me an email. And I would love to help you or work with your school in adopting this framework. I'm able to travel for professional development and whatnot. So please feel free to reach out if you think this is a structure that you would like to integrate in your setting. And thank you for attending my workshop.